Revealed preferences are a cute idea, right? When you have a platform in which everything that's not forbidden is mandatory, you cannot learn from your users.
I'm laughing a little, just like, no one's going to be insane enough to go turn on the ads. I did. I want better ads. I don't think that was a common user behavior.
I promise you're an outlier. I promise you're an outlier.
Oh, I can tell you that. No, I know that's not normal. Today, I'm talking with Cory Doctorow, author of Enshittification. You might have heard this word over the last few years. I think it encapsulates a lot of how I have felt about the internet and how a lot of people have. His thesis is simple and somewhat bleak. These big tech platforms start off by giving users lots of consumer surplus, and then over time, they will take value back from them, give it to businesses, and then over time, take the value back that they were giving to businesses and give it to themselves. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're going to go into some stuff around consumer choice and attention dynamics. When I was thinking about why this conversation mattered, it was because while the word is a little silly, enshittification is not maybe not something you'd say to your grandma, but it does resonate, and it's an idea that's making rounds, and I think is going to end up being cited in some upcoming regulatory conversations that we have on the U.S. and international level. So, Cory, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on and talking to you about this stuff.
I'd like to start with the company, maybe with Meta. Maybe can you walk us through what enshittification looks like with Meta? And I might interject some questions along the way.
Sure. So in 2006, Mark Zuckerberg opened Facebook beyond people at American colleges who had a .edu address. And he said to them, look, I know that you are already on a social media platform called MySpace, but has it occurred to you that MySpace is owned by an evil, senescent, crapulent Australian immortal vampire billionaire named Rupert Murdoch who spies on you all the time? Facebook is much better because it's not owned by an evil billionaire, and we will never, ever spy on you. And so the users piled into the platform, and they locked themselves into the platform. So other platforms have to do some pretty exotic stuff to do lock-in. If you're Uber, you've got to take $33 billion worth of Saudi money through SoftBank and then lose 41 cents on every dollar you bring in for 13 years until the whole world is disinvested in public transit and all the other cab companies have gone under because they haven't had this subsidy. And then you can raise prices. Then you've got the lock-in because there's no other alternative. You're the only game in town in many places. But with Amazon, the lock-in happens by itself, or rather, the users of Amazon do the lock-in through something economists call the collective action problem, which, you love your friends, but they're a pain in the ass. And if you can't agree on what board game you're going to play this weekend, you certainly can't agree on when it's time to leave Facebook, especially if some of you are there because there are people with the same rare disease as you congregating there, or that's where you keep in touch with the people in the country you moved away from, or that's where you meet your audience or your customers, or, it's how you organize the carpool for your kids' Little League. And so once the users are locked in, we can move on to phase 2, which is to make things worse for the users, understanding that the users probably won't leave because there is that high switching cost, and you can make things better for business customers. So you can go to the advertisers and say, look, you remember we told these rubes we weren't going to spy on them? Obviously, that was a lie. We spy on them from asshole to appetite. Give us remarkably small sums of money, and we'll target ads to them with exquisite fidelity. And because we're such dedicated craftspeople, we've installed a whole building full of engineers who are going to fight ad fraud from morning till night. So if you give us $1 to show an ad to a user, we're going to show that ad to that user, and you can be sure of it. And then for publishers, they say, hey, you remember we told these rubes we'd only show them what they asked to see. Obviously, that's also a lie. We will cram stuff into people's eyeballs on your behalf. Just give us excerpts from your website with links, and we'll give you a free traffic funnel. So the advertisers, the publishers, they move in and they get locked in too, because it's much easier to have a monopsony where you're a powerful buyer than it is to have a monopoly when you're a powerful seller. If you're a firm who gets, say, 20% of your receipts from some key customer, if that customer goes away overnight, it might be the last day that your business is open. You're going to have to get new loans. You probably can't make your payroll. You might need some rent relief from your landlord. And so even a business that has a 20% share of your products can boss you around almost as though they had 100% share. So you have these advertisers, these publishers become very dependent on Facebook. And Facebook starts to put the screws to them too. It's not true that if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. Even if you pay for the product, they'll make you the product if they can. And so advertisers find that these ads that they pay for, they suddenly become much more expensive, while ad targeting fidelity has gone through the floor. And meanwhile, ad fraud has exploded to the point that when Procter & Gamble zeroed out its $200 million per year programmatic ad spend in 2017, they saw a 0% drop in sales because basically $200 million worth of ads were just disappearing down the fraud hole. Publishers, meanwhile, find that they've got to put longer and longer excerpts just to be shown to their own subscribers, much less to be recommended. It gets to the point where you have to replicate your website on Facebook, be fully substitutive, be a commodity back-end supplier to Facebook, and woe betide the publisher that puts a link back to their own website on Facebook, because Facebook will treat that as a, quote, malicious link, and they won't show it to anyone. And so now your only path to monetization is that ad market that's become totally crooked. So this is the end state that Facebook seeks, the equilibrium, where all the value that can be withdrawn has, and it's been reallocated to shareholders and executives. The problem with that equilibrium is it's very brittle, right? The difference between I hate this place, but I can't seem to stop coming here, and I hate this place, and I'm never coming back, it's razor thin. All it takes is a live stream mass shooting, a big privacy scandal, a whistleblower, people bolt for the exits, Wall Street gets cold feet, the share price drops, the company panics. Although being technical people, they have a technical term for panicking. They call it pivoting. And so it is that Mark Zuckerberg one morning arises from his sarcophagus and he says, "Hearken to me, brothers and sisters, for I have had a vision. I know I told you that the future would consist of you arguing with your most racist uncle using the primitive text interface that I created in my Harvard dorm room so I could non-consensually rate the fuckability of my fellow undergraduates. But actually, the future is one in which I transform you and everyone you love into a legless, sexless, low polygon, heavily surveilled cartoon character, and then imprison you in a virtual world I stole from a 25-year-old cyberpunk novel that I call the metaverse." And that is end stage enshittification, a giant pile of shit.
Now that is a quite strong view. I want to start with the users. So in the case of the users, as it gets shittier for a meta user, wouldn't the sign that it's shittier, they would decrease their time spent on the platform, right? That would be the sign of enshittification?
Well, it depends, right? If you have to spend more time on the platform to reach the stuff that matters to you, right? So there's a really wonderful nonprofit called the Light Collective. It was started by a woman called Andrea Downing. And Andrea Downing is a breast cancer previvor. So she has the gene for breast cancer. And she was part of a group of people who Facebook enticed to move to Facebook, move their support group to Facebook. I think it was in 2010. Maybe it was 2013. And it was very early on. Breast cancer previvor, it's a pretty intense community, right? Because you're on the one hand making some pretty severe medical decisions about your own health, right? Should I have my uterus removed, my ovaries? Should I have my breasts removed? But also, you know, the women in your life, your daughters, your mothers, your sisters, your aunts, they're dying, right? Or they're very sick. And so that community means a lot. Now, Andrea, she wasn't a security researcher by trade, but one day she was poking around on the platform and she figured out that you could enumerate the identity of all the members of any group on the platform, whether or not you were a member of that group. And when she reported this to Facebook, Facebook won't fix it. They said, "Oh no, that's part of the ad tech stack. It's a feature, not a bug." But they couldn't leave because they mattered to each other more than this gross, terrible privacy violation scared them. They loved each other more than they hated Mark Zuckerberg. They actually sued Facebook.
So, I mean, that was 2010. So there were less, but I mean, there's lots of options now, right? Like there's Discord and Circle and a million other places. And
so the problem was convincing everyone to go. Let me give you an example of a time that it went differently, right? When Mark Zuckerberg was tempting people out of MySpace, his pitch didn't end with, "We have a better privacy policy, so come hang out in splendid isolation, smugly rereading our privacy policy while you wait for your stupid friends to get the message and join you here." He gave those users a bot. And if you gave that bot your login and password to MySpace, it would go to MySpace several times a day, impersonate you, grab everything waiting for you on the platform, put it in your Facebook feed, and you could reply to it and push it back out to MySpace, right? You could do that to Facebook today, except because of the metastasis of IP law, Facebook would reduce you to radioactive rubble if you try. And so you're right that like people might want to go and they do have other options, but you know, building a lot of housing for people in East Berlin when you're in West Berlin does not mean you'll get any tenants. You have to tear the wall down. And we built this wall that stops people from leaving. And there were a lot of people who could have left East Berlin in onesie twosies, but leaving behind everyone and everything they had meant that they stayed. Today, you get on the U-Bahn and you go from Kreuzberg to the K-Dam, and you go back again for dinner, and no one gives a damn. You take the wall away, people get to make easier choices.
The thing I kept thinking about was the case of, stated versus revealed preferences, right? The FTC in the recent lawsuit against Meta, it showed that I think it was 7% of content that was being shown to you was from people you knew. The rest was ads and from people like you and me who make stuff, content for a living. At first, I was like, that's terrible. But on the other hand, people, they keep going back. There's infinite content options. You don't have to go back. So how do you... And the social network is no longer the lock-in that it was for that, in the case you're talking about in the early 2010s. So how do you square this for me?
I don't see why not. Right? If those people and their lives matter to you a lot, then the fact that it's harder to reach them on Facebook doesn't mean you'll spend less time. It means you'll spend more. Revealed preferences are a cute idea. But the problem with neoliberal economics, which is where we get revealed preferences from, is that it has no theory of power. It says that if we can't reduce something to a quantitative state that we can embed in a model, we can safely ignore it. And so this is how you get ideas like revealed preferences, which is things like, if people are selling their kidneys to make rent, they must have a revealed preference for one kidney. Right? I think that unless you consider power, then you cannot understand the coercive relationships that people are in the world. You can say that there's a revealed preference to have Mark Zuckerberg spy on you, since so many of us get spied on by Mark Zuckerberg. But when Apple modified iOS to give you a single tick box that would allow you to block Meta spying, 96% of Facebook users click that, or Apple users rather, click that box. And you got to assume the other 4% either worked for Meta or were drunk Meta employees, which makes a lot of sense because I think if I had to work for Meta, I would be drunk all the time, right? So what is the revealed preference here? Is the true revealed preference that people didn't mind Mark Zuckerberg being up in their business? Or is the true revealed preference that as soon as they had the option, they blocked him from spying? And that means that they were being spied on under duress before there.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. It's just these platforms are so large, and this is in support of your argument. They're so large. They're a huge bundle of related jobs for these users. Like, I don't use Facebook's social media feed, but I use Facebook Marketplace all the time. It's the best place to get stuff for my kid because I can't buy everything new. So I use Facebook Marketplace, but I'm happily married, so I don't use Facebook Dating. And so it makes sense to me from a network effect of like, hey, there's this big lock-in, everyone you knew on there. But over time, as the platform gets larger, it's less one individual service or one individual friend on there and more of there's just this big web of related services that are offered for free. I've done you sold a lot of software or done a lot of media companies over the years, and you'll know this too. People just always choose free. They love free. Free is just it's very hard for people to buy subscriptions to everything they need in their life. And so ads is this way to not have to do that.
Well, I think that's true, but I also think it's incomplete because what people are willing to give you in exchange for you taking ads and what they expect back from you is dynamic. It's not graven in stone. Advertisers say that they'd like best brandy, but they'll settle for small beer. When I was running Boing Boing in the early 2000s with my business partners then, I was one of the founders of a website called Boing Boing. That was a big media company, independent. We had about 9 million readers, and we did a lot of business. And at the start, we had a sales force, and they would go out and sell ads. And it was before programmatic ads. And our advertisers were really interested in having pop-up ads. In fact, they insisted. And I'm not talking about today's wimpy, denatured pop-up ads. I'm talking about like real kind of dinosaur pop-up ads that spawned a whole browser window that if you tried to close it would shrink to 1 pixel and then run away from your cursor while auto-playing audio. And we would say to them, hey guys, our readers hate these pop-up ads and we'd really prefer not to show them to them. And they would say, well, guys, that sounds like a you problem. Right? Because we think pop-up ads will sell more stuff. And so if you want our ad dollars, you're going to have those pop-up ads. Now, once 2 browser companies, Opera and Mozilla, which is a precursor to Firefox, started shipping pop-up ad blockers by default, We went back to those advertisers who said that there was no interest at all in advertising with anything other than a pop-up. And we said, look at our server logs. 90% of our users can't even see a pop-up ad anymore. And they were like, oh, yeah, that's fine. We don't have to show them pop-up ads. We'll just go back to regular ads, right? They only demand the things that make sense for them, that are possible. Now, 51% of web users have installed an ad blocker, because the web is an open platform. And that means that you can decompose those pre-feast offers that come from tech companies, where you have to take everything or nothing, into an a la carte menu, where you can discard the parts that you think are obnoxious and you can keep the parts that you like. And so what that means is that if you're like a product manager and you're planning your website and you say, well, look, our KPI is, top line ad revenue. We think maybe we make the ads 20% more obnoxious and invasive. We'll get a 2% lift in that key number. Someone at the meeting is going to stick their hand up and say, like, Elon, I love how you think, but has it occurred to you that if you make the ads 20% more obnoxious and invasive, that might inspire 40% of our users to search for how do you block ads? And once they do that, we're never going to get those users back. They don't generate a dime for us, because no one's ever gone back and searched for how do I start seeing ads again. So you have to tread lightly, right? You have to think about what your users are willing to accept and what they're not willing to accept. It's not a marketplace where someone walks in the store and you take everything out of your wallet and say, I'll be having that, right? You have to actually bargain with them. Now, apps are like the web, except that under a law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, you have to reverse engineer them, and that becomes illegal, right? So any kind of reverse engineering of anything with an access control is illegal under the DMCA, and it carries a penalty of a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine. So an app is really just a website skinned in the right kind of IP to make it a crime to defend your privacy while you use it. And companies are insatiably horny to get you not to use their website and to use their apps. And at that product meeting, when someone says, hey, how much more obnoxious and invasive are we going to make the ads in our app? The answer is going to be as much as we can, because we don't care if someone goes and searches for how do you block ads in the app, because the answer is you can't. So if you care about good product design, if you care about products that your users like, if you care about learning from your users what they'll tolerate and what they won't, as opposed to what you can cram down their throats and what you can't, then there has to be space for your users to push back. Twitter, all of its key features, retweet and quote tweet and so on, those came from observing behaviors that arose within the user community. They just spontaneously started typing RT and then pasting in the text of a tweet. And Twitter was like, look at how popular this feature is, right? When you have a platform in which everything that's not forbidden is mandatory, you cannot learn from your users. And so you will stagnate, because your product team does not know what your users want. Your users know what they want. Contra this idea of revealed preferences, where if you can coerce your users into doing something, you've discovered that they don't want what they do want and that they do want what they don't want. If you actually observe your users and find out where the desire paths are, you'll find out what they really want.
I'm laughing a little because no one's going to be insane enough to go turn on the ads. I did. I hit the first button when it came on, and then I got so annoyed because all the ads on the internet were so irrelevant to my life that I went back and turned it back on, because I was just like, I want better ads. If I'm going to have ads, I might as well have ones that I like.
Sure.
So I guess I'm one of those. I don't think that was a common user behavior.
I promise you're an outlier. I promise you're an outlier.
I could tell you that. No, I know
that's without prejudice to your preferences. It's just as a factual matter, you are an outlier.
It's easy when we're talking about what you called neoliberal economics to say, oh, it's just revealed versus stated preferences. But I think people are a little more complex than that. And in my own case, with my relationship to social media, I don't like it, but I still end up on it. In my own life, there's this tension. So I want to move on to the next stage of enshittification, which is it gets worse for the businesses that are operating on the platform. For the case of Procter & Gamble, what happened to their programmatic ad spend after they dropped it down to zero? Do they spend more on it now?
They refactored it, and they do spend money on it now. What they did was they went back and they started to do their own anti-fraud. So they're spending a lot more on ads, because they're not just paying the platforms to do the ads, but they're doing their own audit of the ads. They're doing their own anti-fraud and spending a lot of time sort of mucking around with this stuff. It's a thing that Procter & Gamble can afford to do, but the people that get lionized in debates about advertising online are SMEs, and they can't afford to do this.
Yeah.
The idea that, oh, well, how are you going to make your Zumba studio and, Whitehorse a success if you can't target ads to people who are looking to get fit in the Yukon? So we need to have surveillance ads so we can find out who's been, Googling, how do I get on a diet and lose weight in the high Arctic? Those people can't afford the anti-fraud.
Your belief today is that for a platform like Meta, these ads are not effective.
I think that they are of extremely low efficacy. And I think that, moreover, when you compare them to the efficacy of serving content based ads, the differential is not that large. Do you know when content based ads first emerged? Advertisers were incredibly excited. They were like, what do you mean I can actually just buy ads over stories based on their content instead of buying page 3 of the magazine and rolling the dice and hoping that the story on page 4 isn't about like a serial killer who dismembered their victims, right? Where you can actually say, well, I want my shoe ads running just over stories about shoes and athletics and so on. And then we got behavioral ads, and it was like, okay, well, you're not going to just buy the content anymore. You're going to run your ads based on users. So, find me 18 to 34-year-old man children on Staten Island who own an Xbox and have been recently searching for information about treating gonorrhea, right? And like, sure, advertisers are convinced that that's going to do better, and they do eke out some marginal gains. Those gains regress to the mean pretty quickly. So a lot of the initial blush of gain really came back down, partly because you have other advertisers using the same thing, and partly because it's such a vector for fraud that users just become more suspicious of ads. One of the things about surveillance advertising is it just opens up all kinds of exploitation opportunities. In the last days of the Biden administration, I testified for Rohit Chopra at the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau in the hearings on whether or not to ban data brokers. I talked about some pretty esoteric computer science ideas related to re-identification, how you can have de-identified data sets and then you have a leak, and then you can use the leak as a key to re-identify the data sets. And this is an unquantifiable risk. You never know what kind of re-identification you're going to suffer as a result. But, the speaker before me was from the Pentagon, and she was speaking about the fact that you can target ads to people on military bases who have gambling problems. And the speaker after me was from the AARP, and she was speaking about the fact that you can target ads to seniors with cognitive decline, right? So the problems of surveillance advertising are pretty immense, and the gains that you get from surveillance advertising are pretty modest. And I think that if we had any kind of real, thoughtful approach to privacy in this country, that we would have decided to get rid of this. But unfortunately, we haven't really had that democratic deliberation. Our last consumer privacy law in America federally was 1988's Video Privacy Protection Act. Ronald Reagan signed a bill that made it illegal for video store clerks to disclose your VHS rental histories. That's the last privacy threat that Congress has defended us against. And the vacuum has been filled with some pretty bad actors. If you're a nurse, hospitals want to preferentially hire you as a contractor. It's how they do union avoidance. And they used to hire contract nurses through local staffing agencies, but now there's 4 giant apps. They all call themselves Uber for nurses. And one of the things those apps can do is look up a nurse's recent credit history, because the data brokerage sector is completely unregulated, and they can find out how much credit card debt a nurse has before offering them a shift. And the more debt that nurse is carrying, the lower the wage they're offered, right? It's a kind of desperation premium. And, that's not a thing that I think most of us want. No one wants to really think about the idea that the nurse who's inserting their catheter had to drive Uber till midnight the night before and skip breakfast this morning to make the rent, right? It's not a good policy outcome for anyone except for a couple of hospitals and their administrators who are shaving nickels at the expense of nurses' well-being.
Yeah, I agree. The ads can be a little creepy, right? With how targeted they can be. And it's not just like, oh, businesses can do creepy things, but bad actors too. Like with these data brokers, it's a it's a whole nother podcast how messed up these data brokers are, but how the government will use them as a legal
books,
way to ignore.
Yeah.
Yes, I have strong feelings about these data brokers, and I very much agree with you on this, that this stuff is terrible. And I also think your argument is correct on that the marginal gain of these ads has decreased over time. In the 2015s, 2016s, when you're running these, it was easy to make money. And it built some great, Warby Parker was able to use that to go up against
EssilorLuxottica. Yeah.
uh-huh. And so, like, they're, especially in the earlier years, but now these platforms are so competitive that it is much harder. Like the level of profit that's available to the merchant is much, much less than it used to be.
And in part, that's because ad targeting fidelity has collapsed, right? So these lookalike audiences, all these other tricks that Facebook claims are just as good as targeting based on behavior factors, they're just empirically not. It's just a way for Facebook to rook advertisers. And, frankly, advertisers have always been rubes, right? Wanamaker of Wanamaker's department store very famously said, half my advertising dollars are wasted. I just don't know which half. What a sucker that guy was if he thought that only half his advertising dollars were being wasted, right? Like we know from, the era of metrics that it was more like 98% of his advertising dollars. The one person that an ad man can reliably sell things to is a client or a customer for ads. They may not be able to sell the thing the ad's selling, but they sure can sell the person who's going to advertise with them.
Meta has lost market share over time. Amazon, as our ad business done wonderful. Uber was the fastest ever to DoorDash was the fastest ever to $1 billion ad marketplace. So there are even now versus 5 years ago, significantly more competitors on the
Although
ad side.
Amazon's ad marketplace doesn't belong in that category. Amazon's ad marketplace is mostly just payola. Right, it's pay for placement and search results, $53 billion a year, up from 32 2 years ago. And it's why the top result on Amazon in a SERP page is on average 29% more expensive than the best match for your query. The top row is 25% more expensive, and the best match is about 17 places down on the second page. Right, that's just Amazon extracting rent from platform sellers. It's not really advertising at all.
Yeah, I debated on whether the right case study was Amazon, but I was like, we're going to go down into shelf placement fees and the comparison with physical retail and stuff that only people who nerd out about this really would care about. So if the end state is users are bad, it's bad for users, it's bad for businesses, then the only way that people stay is there's some sort of lock-in or there's some non-competitive services.
Yeah.
Right? And so for the case of Meta, how do you square that with, like, say, the rise of TikTok? TikTok took a bunch of market share. They panicked and they had to change their feed and all sorts of stuff. How do you square that with TikTok?
Well, it's true. If you have a state-invested enterprise from one of the richest countries in the world and they pour everything into it, they might be able to eke out a victory, right? But that's not the cycle that we had in the days of 6 Degrees to classmates.com to MySpace to Facebook. And if you want to allow smaller firms to compete, right? If you want to have new market entry, if you want startups to be able to compete, you want interoperability. You want to soften those IP laws, and you want to get rid of those acqui-hires and those anti-competitive acquisitions that cement the position of these firms. You really want there to be a big dynamic marketplace with lots and lots of firms in it. I understand why any individual entrepreneur, and especially their investors, would like an acqui-hire. But if you actually are going for the brass ring and you want to start a real business and not just have a glorified finder's fee for putting together a team that then gets hired by one of the big five, then you don't want the big five consolidating their position by scooping up every promising startup. You want those businesses to stand on their own.
In my world, most of the explanation for the consolidation in the market share for the last 5 years or last decade has been attention aggregation theory from Ben Thompson, which is, hey, these platforms, they get the attention, that gives them more attention. It just gets more and more and more over time. And to the point now where Google acts on the toll booth on information and Meta acts on the toll booth of entertainment, of connection, which is these really big, broad swaths of every person on the planet. And they've just gotten that. And most people in Silicon Valley and most of the people I talk to say, well, that's fine, because the next paradigm shift, which in this today is AI, will disrupt them and we'll be able to overcome them. Which I'm going to guess you disagree with that assumption. But
I think AI is just asbestos we're shoveling into the walls. I think the number of foundation models, given how dog shit the unit economics are, no one's going to make back $700 billion in capex on an industry that grosses $45 billion a year, especially not when those assets depreciate over 36 months. So I just think that what we're looking at is a crash where the 7 firms that are 29% of the S&P 500, passing around the same $100 billion IOU around and around and around again and booking it as revenue, are going to reach a point where other people's money is no longer available to them in this incredible quantity, and then we're going to have a crash that makes 2008 look like a walk in the park. So I think a lot of our questions about AI and what we should allow it to do and what we shouldn't allow it to do are really kind of moot, right? They assume that the number of foundation models extant in 10 years won't be zero, which I think there's a pretty good chance that it is zero. We'll still have federated learning. We'll have a lot of open source models. Someone's going to be able to buy a lot of GPUs on the cheap. And certainly you're going to be able to hire a lot of applied statisticians for a lot less than they're making now. But I think most of these AI questions are just silly because they're presuming that what goes up won't come down. It's like asking what we're going to do after everything is on the blockchain and we're all using NFTs.
I was very much with you on the NFT point, but I think I have a slightly more positive view of where the unit economics of AI. But I want to assume you're right. Let's assume
a product that gets more expensive every time someone uses it and more expensive every time they make it better is not a product that is going to find a path to profitability, let alone recouping that CapEx overhang. So.
Let's say you're totally right. Total bust. Sure. Sam Altman has to sell one of his 10 luxury properties to drop down to 9. The poor man.
Right.
In the book you argue pretty convincingly that the answer is antitrust. That we need much stronger antitrust laws to end these monopolies of retention. Maybe walk through how you view the history of antitrust and where we are today.
Yeah, so the origins of antitrust, they're in the 1890s. You have Senator John Sherman, brother of Tecumseh Sherman, the guy who burned down Atlanta rather, who writes the eponymous bill, the Sherman Act, and in 1890 he's stumping for it. And he says on the floor of the Senate, if we would not have a king of America, we should not permit an autocrat of trade with the power to set the prices of the necessaries of life. Right? So what he's arguing is that firms that are too big to fail become too big to jail and also too big to care, right? And that the thing you have to do is not just police monopolies that abuse their power. You have to prevent their formation because once monopolies are formed, they become very hard to dislodge. And he knew what he was talking about. This was the era of rail barons and the trusts and so on. And over the next 20-some years, we saw the development of an antitrust practice that went after a lot of different concentrated sectors, culminating in the breakup of Standard Oil, which, I'll point out, if you were a Standard Oil investor, was great for you. The 7 companies that Standard Oil was broken up into very quickly were doing more business in aggregate than Standard Oil was when it was all on its own. Same thing happened after the breakup of AT&T. And so for most of the rest of the century, the way that we practiced antitrust was to treat any kind of incipient monopoly or tactics that could lead to monopoly, like serial acquisition, like roll-ups, like extracting preferential discounts by big retailers from suppliers that would make it impossible for smaller firms to enter the market because their retail price would be higher than the wholesale price that the established firms are paying. Anyone who's ever tried to outcompete Walmart knows exactly what that looks like. Your corner store can probably buy Coke more cheaply from Walmart to put in its fridge than they can from the Coca-Cola company, right? So all of these things were banned. They remain banned. But in the 1970s, a theorist with the Chicago School, a guy called Robert Bork, notorious for being a virulent racist, for being Richard Nixon's bagman. He was the guy who fired all the DOJ lawyers when no one else would because they knew it was illegal to do so. He was Nixon's Solicitor General. He was almost a Supreme Court judge. Reagan tried to put him on the Supreme Court, but when all this stuff came out, he handled it so badly during his confirmation hearing that today we describe anything that goes very bad as being borked. That's the origin of that phrase. And incidentally, one of the things that happened to Robert Bork during his confirmation hearing was that a video store clerk leaked his video store rental history to a magazine in Washington. It turns out, like, the best thing you could say about Robert Bork is he had pretty good taste in movies, but Congress freaked out and said, oh my God, what's going to happen when all the things I rent from behind the beaded curtain at the video store come out? And that's when we got the last privacy law that America's ever seen, the Video Privacy Protection Act. It was because of Robert Bork and his confirmation hearing. And Robert Bork had this idea that monopolies were efficient and that policing monopolies was intrinsically perverse, right? That the reason Google gets a 90% market share is because it's really good. And isn't it crazy to punish a company for being really good, for making the product that we all love? That's nuts. And so what we end up with is a 40-year period of declining antitrust enforcement. And that was extremely well bankrolled by firms and individuals who benefited from consolidation in sectors. There was something called the Mann Seminars, M-A-N-N-E, Mann Seminars, that were these luxury junkets held for judges at a resort in Florida. So judges are required to do continuing education, just like lawyers or doctors or other kinds of professionals, teachers, where they have to go back to school every so often and find out what's come up since they graduated from law school, since they were last in practice. And these Mann seminars, they counted towards your continuing education, except all the lectures were about how Robert Bork was right and everyone else was wrong about antitrust. And those judges, 40% of the federal judiciary, afterwards empirically started to rule in favor of monopolies. And so we had a drawdown in monopoly enforcement and a concomitant increase in monopolization. Today, we have cartels of 5 or fewer companies in almost every sector. That's mattresses and athletic shoes. It's rail and also intermodal and sea freight. It's microchips. It's the 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. It's vitamin C in glass bottles, sterile bags of saline, hospital beds and coffins. One company makes all the hospital beds and all the coffins. Think about that for a minute. It's eyeglasses. It's professional wrestling and cheerleading, right? Everything looks like that. And these economists who counseled us that if we had monopolies, everything would be fine, that there was really no such thing as a monopoly as we understood it, because any monopoly that had gained its power by coercing people rather than by delighting people would immediately be dislodged by competitors. These people now look at this kind of blasted landscape of incredible consolidation, stagnation, rent-seeking, and real innovative doldrums. And they say, well, how can you say that these monopolies are our fault? Like, how can you blame them on our pro-monopoly policies? It's as though we used to put down rat poison and we didn't have a rat problem. And then these guys convinced us to stop putting down rat poison. And now rats are eating our faces off. And when we call them on this, they say, well, how do you know it's the anti-rat poison policies, right? Maybe sunspots made rats more fecund than at any time in history. Maybe we are just living through the time of the rat, right? And sure, the rats did buy all the rat poison factories and shut them down, but we're not putting down rat poison anymore. That is economically rational decision. It is Pareto optimal to shut down the rat poison factories. And so one of the things this book is trying to recover is this idea that the origin of our problems, the reason we have an enshitticene is because we have an enshittigenic policy environment, that we changed our policies to reward firms that hurt people instead of firms that made things better. And then the worst people in the firms and the worst impulses of leaders of firms took root and made everything that we rely on shitty.
And the foundation of that argument is basically, hey, Facebook is free, Google is free. And the foundation of most of our antitrust law is it doesn't increase cost to consumers. If you can show it increased cost to consumers,
sure,
we can shut it down. Now, in the book, you argue for something a little bit different. In your perfect world, you're suddenly the head of the FTC. Trump's giving you fist bumps, telling you go be corrupt and do whatever you want. But you're a righteous corruption, so you're going to make the FTC work. How would you rather these firms be regulated? On what basis?
Well, there are a bunch of remedies that we have in our toolkit now that weren't available to old-timey trust busters in the era of J.P. Morgan and Standard Oil. So, the wonderful universality of our tech platforms and of the tech that underpins them, right? The fact that these are universal Turing-complete von Neumann machines that can run every program that is valid means that we can do things like impose interoperability mandates on these firms. So, if you use legacy social media, there's no easy way to leave social media and go somewhere else. If you go from Facebook to Twitter, you have to say goodbye to the people on Facebook. But, there's nothing intrinsic to technology that says that it has to be that way. And modern social media isn't designed that way. Mastodon, Blue Sky, they're designed for federation. And if you look at the way that Mastodon handles federation with the protocol activity pub, when you leave one Mastodon server and go to another, it gives you a little XML object that has everyone you follow, everyone who follows you, all the people you block, and all the people you mute. And you download that from the server you're on, you upload it to a server you're going to, and really in just a few minutes, all of that stuff carries over somewhere new. Now, ActivityPub, it's an open standard. There's open source reference code. We could mandate that firms support this, right? We could say to Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, people who leave your platform have to be able to speak to the people who stay on your platform, and you are required to support this. Now, obviously, there's going to be some CapEx involved in adapting this open source reference code to run on big, hundred of millions of user infrastructure, a billion user infrastructure, but they can afford it. Meanwhile, if you're a new market entrant that wants to be able to poach users and drain them off of Facebook and Twitter, all you need is to download those open source libraries and integrate them into your own code base, and they're free to use, and it's an open standard. So it doesn't really form a capital moat. It also creates a highly administrable remedy, right? If I leave Twitter and Elon Musk doesn't give me the file that I need to reestablish myself on a Blue Sky server or a Mastodon server or a new kind of server that doesn't exist yet, but some listener to this might be thinking about building even as they hear these words, I can go to the regulator, and the regulator can say, Musk, I know you say you gave Corey his file. He says he didn't have it. We're not going to investigate this. We're not going to have hearings. We're not going to subpoena you. All we're going to say is, give us the file you say you gave to Corey, and we'll give it to him. Just escrow it. Right? One person could administer all of the compliance for Twitter, right? One government employee, and still have time at the end of the day to take like an extra lunch break and maybe some meetings with their colleagues and fill them in on how it's going, right? So this is a highly administrable remedy, and it really does impose a lot of discipline onto these platform bosses. If you're so sure about revealed preferences and you think that people want to be on a platform where 90% of the recommended content is either like, slop or spam or Elon Musk musing about the great replacement theory, then let them leave and see what happens. In the era of the GDR of East Berlin, the claim by the German government at the time, the East German government, was that the wall wasn't there to keep people from East Germany in East Berlin. They said that the wall was there to keep people from outside of East Germany out of the socialist paradise that was East Berlin. So if you really think that people are staying on Twitter because they love Twitter and they hate woke, let them leave and see what happens, right? And if you don't get the message, well, then you're going to go the way of MySpace.
So the answer isn't necessarily to redefine what a monopoly is, but to redefine what rights consumers have on the internet.
Well, we might say that they are a monopoly, or we can say, not that they're a monopoly, but that they're engaged in an unfair and deceptive trade practice, which is prohibited under Article 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act. And you don't have to be a monopoly to be unfair and deceptive, right? You can be a supplement seller making $10,000 a month, and if you're ripping people off, it's still a violation of FTC Article 5, and there's still the opportunity for the regulator to impose a remedy on you. And in this case, we have remedies that are quite good. It's not just monopolies that we want to police, right? Anyone who holds your data hostage should have some data protection rules applied to them. The wedding photographer that won't give you your wedding photos is just as important to you as the giant website like Facebook that won't give you your baby pictures when you leave. And I use that example because when the FTC was investigating Facebook, one of the things they published was memos about the creation of Facebook photos, in which the product manager in charge of it emailed Mark Zuckerberg and said, don't worry, we are designing Facebook photos to impose as high a switching cost as possible on anyone who leaves Facebook for Google+. We're going to make sure that they have family photos and other things they don't want to lose, so that they're going to have to give all that up when they go somewhere else, right? So we want data protection against all unfair and deceptive practices, not merely those against large firms, but what we don't want is for the prophylaxis against unfair and deceptive practices to be such an intense compliance mode or capital mode that we don't see new market entry. We want to encourage new market entry because we don't want just the discipline of regulators, the discipline of governments. We want the discipline of markets on these companies too. And for that, you need market entry.
Last question for you. You had the word of the year in 2023 with enshittification. You have the book now. I'm curious what signs you see on a regulatory level or on a market level where you're like, oh, this things are changing, things are happening. I want readers to have, or listeners, readers or listeners to have, is a sense of how powerful is this idea? How am I going to encounter it?
So I think that the most exciting thing happening right now has to do with Trump's unscheduled midair disassembly of the international system of global trade. Right? When for the 20 plus years I've worked for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, one of my arch nemeses has been the US Trade Representative, because everywhere in the world, the US Trade Representative has convinced policymakers to make rules prohibiting interoperability, limiting privacy, and so on, in order to protect the rent seeking of very large American firms. And the carrot for that was free trade with the US, and the stick was the threat of tariffs. So when someone threatens to burn your house down unless you do what they tell you, and then they burn your house down anyway, you're a sucker if you keep doing what they tell you. So, like all the best Americans, I am Canadian. And in Canada, the response to the tariffs has been a retaliatory tariff, which is insane. We are making things more expensive for ourselves in the hopes that it punishes America. That's like punching yourself in the face really hard and hoping the downstairs neighbor says, ouch. But if we legalize jailbreaking, right? If we legalize reverse engineering, if we reverse the law that we put on our books in 2012 to appease the US Trade Representative and secure free trade with the United States, tariff-free access to American markets, then we don't have to confine ourselves to making things more expensive. We can make things cheaper, right? We can take the inkjet printer ink that is $10,000 a gallon and knock it down to $100 a gallon and pocket a great deal of that consumer surplus. And moreover, export those jailbreaking tools that are kept up to date for every printer and every version of every firmware to everyone in the world who wants to refill an ink cartridge. We can do the same for the tools that mechanics use to convert your check engine light into a diagnosis of what's wrong with your engine. We can produce the tools to jailbreak iPhones and install third-party app stores and not have to spend 30% of every dollar appeasing someone in Cupertino who thinks that they're entitled to it. And that's a tool that everyone in the world will buy, right? Canada doesn't need to confine itself to exporting reasonably priced pharmaceuticals to Americans. We can export the tools of technological self-determination, because anyone with a payment method and an internet connection will be able to get these tools. Now, in Europe, they've really taken the bit in their teeth. They're very concerned about the fact that Donald Trump has made it clear that he views other countries as competitors and rivals, and that he will use big tech to attack them, right? So when the International Criminal Court goes after Benjamin Netanyahu, he has Microsoft cut off the chief prosecutor of the ICC's email, address book, calendar, and all their files. Right? So they're building the Eurostack right now, clones of American platforms, and they're pretty soon going to hit the wall that is migration. No one is going to copy and paste 1 million documents from their government ministry out of Office 365 or G Drive and G Suite and into a European open source version, nor are those American tech companies going to willingly help them migrate their data. And so they're going to have to embrace reverse engineering. They're going to have to embrace scraping and alt clients and all these other tools to get their data off these platforms. This used to be a very honorable trade, migrating data and connections out of one platform into another, or bridging two platforms that weren't meant to talk to one another. We kind of forgot about it, but it's time we revive that more elegant weapon from a civilized era and use it to, fight the forces of darkness.
Well, I love it. The first silver lining to Trump's trade policies, maybe.
Indeed.
Well, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you.
If they wanted to hear more from you, where could listeners go?
Oh, well, pluralistic.net is my newsletter, and it's syndicated onto a bunch of social platforms. It's still on Twitter for the time being. Soon it'll be on Blue Sky when I get my own Blue Sky server set up and running. You can get on Mastodon. It's full text RSS. It's a free newsletter with no tracking, no read receipts, no ads. My website is open license Creative Commons attribution, so you can reproduce and sell the articles there if you'd like for free. So pluralistic.net.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.